Today on the Roundhouse, we're learning about how a K4s Pacific from the Pennsylvania Railroad is coming back to life. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode 108 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, we discuss it. Today, when I'm releasing this, June 25th, falls one day after the announcement that the Railroaders Memorial Museum is launching a targeted campaign to restore Pennsylvania Railroad number 1361 K4s Pacific back to operation. I want to thank the Railroaders Memorial Museum for inviting me to attend the press conference, because here's what's cool about the podcast. So you may have already seen the announcement elsewhere by now, but at the end of the presentation, I went on Facebook and I asked you guys to submit questions for Wick Mormon and for the museum, because I thought you might have some questions. And so it was great to have that participation. First, we're going to listen to the first two-thirds of the press conference, where we hear from the executive director, Joe DeFrancesco, the president of the board, Wick Mormon, and Davidson Ward, who is the president of FMW Solutions, which is the company that is being contracted with helping to oversee the restoration. Three people, incidentally, we've had on the podcast before, so it's great to have them on in this capacity. We're going to hear from them. I cut the last third out because that was just a lot of politician representatives saying, oh, we support this, which is fine and dandy, but I don't feel it's the most relevant stuff. So we're going to hear from those three guys first, and then we'll get to some questions that you guys had for the team about what to expect from the restoration. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. We talk a lot about different railroad topics, and hope that you check more of our episodes out at theroundhousepodcast.com.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I am Joe DeFrancesco, and I'm the executive director of the museum here. Well, it's been a long time coming, but here we are. We have the team, and we need the partnerships to get this project going. It is a new day for the museum and for this K4 locomotive, but there's a few things that I'd like to convey to you. This is not a museum of artifacts alone. It is the story that they tell through the people, the human element, and the human side of the story. It's about the people who built this town, who built this country. This locomotive is the embodiment of their testament of hard work, labor, dedication, and loyalty. A railroad town. Altoona Railroad City is something that we celebrate here at the museum. I came here a little bit over 16 years ago as a volunteer. People who question volunteerism, I question their motives, because I'm here to tell you that volunteerism works. They are the backbone of this organization. They have been for a very long time, and it's because of the dedication. That same spirit that founded this city is the same thing that we do here at the museum. And we want to do better, and we want to do more. There's somebody here I'd like to thank, is Dave Seidel, a local historian. He's in the back there. Dave is a founding member of this museum, and like Dave, in that same spirit, we have board members and volunteers who are over here to my right, who have been sticking with this project through thick and thin. It's a new day for this museum, like I've said, and we ask for your sincere support and a willingness to see us through this. We feel that this locomotive will be what takes this museum to the next chapter in its history. It's something that can travel across the Commonwealth, create resources, and create opportunity. And I think as you hear the speakers here today, you can't help but I think find a common word is opportunity. And with that opportunity, it's going to take a lot of support to make that happen. I thank the board of directors for being here, being by my side, working together to get this job done and get it started. Our staff, they're here. You might have met them on the way in. They've been doing a fantastic job to get this day, to make it possible. Something that I would like to encourage all of you is when you leave here today is to spread the word that we are about the people of railroading and about making opportunity something where new generations can get involved and make something of it. We are working to create a sustainable organization, and the best way to support the project is to buy a membership. And from there, the possibilities are endless. Today, we are joined by elected officials and our new strategic partner, FMW Solutions, who will be involved with getting this K4 restoration underway. But really, looking back, what's got us to this point is our volunteers. Until FMW was selected or even thought of, it was really under the leadership of Mike Reindl and Andy Charlesworth and their helpers, Joe Harella and Brandon Slyko, who've been coming in weekly, sometimes more than once a week, to do what needs to be done to keep the project alive. So, gentlemen, thank you for what you've done. And throughout this process, somebody, I would say very unlikely, came to the table to help us. Mr. Wick Mormon, retired president, CEO of Norfolk Southern and Amtrak, through the Altoona experience, you can say, came here, and he too believes in this project and in the museum, and frankly, without his support, the board members, and one of our board members who couldn't be here today, Bennett Levin, without their partnership and the governance of the organization, we wouldn't be here today to have this event. We would be somewhere else. So I appreciate your efforts in making this possible. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Wick Mormon.
I hope you were applauding for Joe, because I always tell people, don't ever applaud a speaker before you've heard what they say. Thank you, Joe. Probably the very best, smartest thing we did when we got involved, in particular Bennett, whom I'll talk about for a second, was hire Joe, who has come in and made a radical difference, hired a great team. I see a couple of them back there, Miranda and Jendi. Where's Mark Frederick? Andrew Brumwall's got a tie on. That's all I remember. There he is in the back. And it's just wonderful, the job that they've done. Let me first of all thank all of you for coming. Thank all of you for coming as well, and the folks that you represent. So I'm an old railroader, and old railroaders tend to tell stories. My wife tells me that all the time, and she's not happy about it. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about this place and how we've come to where we are today, and why I'm here. So in a past life, as you might imagine, I would come to Altoona a couple of times a year. I'd visit the shops, walk around, see everything that was going on, try and shake as many folks' hands as I could. And we have a great workforce up here. And I always said that the Altoona was kind of when the Conrail transaction was done all over, and the dust had settled and the blood had been wiped up, that what we didn't really understand was what a great asset we got when we got these shops, that this was the jewel that we just didn't see that we had. And I feel that way and have always felt that way. I also, at the same time, had a chance very early in those visits to go through the museum. And I thought then, as I think today, that it was just remarkably well done. A wonderful job of telling a story, not only a story about the railroad, as Joe said, but more importantly, a story of the town and the people of the town. And I think I've been to a lot of railroad museums, as you might imagine, and I think this is the best of its type that I've ever seen. So with all of that as background, how did I happen to be coming here standing up? Because as Joe said, it wasn't expected. I thought, I forgot how you phrased it, it was like you weren't sure. But I'll put it very simply, I was a kid who loved trains, right? Some kids grow out of it, a few don't. And there are more of you in this room than just me, by the way. And as an aside, I will say, I always tell people you will never meet anyone more fortunate than I am in terms of the career that I've had. But as someone with a lifelong fascination in the railroad industry, Altoona was just in and of itself always a great place to visit. And the Pennsylvania Railroad, the standard railroad of the world, although in some ways it really wasn't, was part of that. And then as part of that was this locomotive, the K4. And my particular interest in the K4 began when I had this brainwave. And when you're CEO of a company, you can have the occasional spasmodic brainwave, and nobody really wants to get in your way. That wouldn't it be great to have a representative working steam locomotive of all of our predecessor companies? And the first one, because I started with the Southern Railway, was a locomotive down in Tennessee. Should I answer spam risk? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Yeah. Persistent. The 4501, a Southern locomotive down at the Tennessee Valley Railway Museum in Chattanooga. We helped sponsor putting that back together. Shane Metter with FMW ran that project right here. I got to know Shane then. Then we put together, or helped put back in service, a very famous locomotive, a Norfolk and Western locomotive, J-Class, the 611, which was over at the Virginia Transportation Museum. And now, for those of you who don't know, you can go see it working in Strasburg right now. It's worth a visit. And then the next step in my mind was I knew there was a K4 up here. So, and I knew it had a history. I didn't know that much of the history. I don't know that much of it today. I have no desire to know any of it, but I knew it was up here and it was kind of in pieces and they were distributed. So I started down the path in two ways. The first was that I started talking to this gentleman that Joe mentioned, Bennett Levin, and who is a force of nature in a lot of ways. Rob, is that a fair description? I had met Bennett along the way. Bennett knew all about the locomotive, knew all about the museum, and he at some point said, "We got to go on the board of the museum." And I thought, well, what? And then I also talked to a gentleman named Don Faulkner, who ran the shops here at Altoona at the time, and I said something about the K4, and he said, "Oh, you've heard this story, you've got to talk to Mikey." I thought, well, who's Mikey? And of course it was Mike Reindl. And we came over to visit Mike and the illustrious team of volunteers here, and back in the back building was the frame of the locomotive, right here. And I walked in there, and I will tell you, I thought it was like walking into a warehouse somewhere and seeing a reconstructed dinosaur skeleton. It was that unexpected. But these gentlemen had, for years, been slowly but surely working on the locomotives. And Joe mentioned their names, but let me say them again. Mike Reindl, Andy Charlesworth, Joe Harala, Brandon Slyko, Dave Seidel he mentioned too. They were just back there continuously working, and as Mike kept telling me, it's only metal. So, okay. In the meantime, Bennett talked me into joining the board, where we discovered we had some issues. I want to give a special shout out to the good folks at PNC Bank who worked with us to clean up some financial issues the museum had. They were terrific. A lady named Colleen McCullough in Philly was just terrific to work with. And one of the things that's come out of that is I'm really happy to say that the museum, I think, is in the best financial shape that it's been in maybe forever, close to forever. Finally, I want to do, so anyway, got involved, hired Joe, got a terrific team, then brought FMW to the table, Davidson, Shane, Wolf Fengler, who the first time I met him told me that he had convinced his father at age what? 12. At age 12 to build a live steam working engine for him. I thought I didn't have enough sense to try and get my dad to do that. And they are the best. They are absolutely the best. They are professionals. They've done lots of work like this. They have the engineering know-how. They have the management know-how. They have the mechanical know-how. And with them on the team, as well as the rest of the folks, we're gonna make this work. We're gonna put this thing back together. And it's gonna be great. And it's gonna be great not just because I love trains, right? And working steam locomotives are really cool. It's gonna be great for this city. And it's gonna be great for Pennsylvania. And great for the people here. And that's what, at the end of the day, always matters. Because this is absolutely a symbol of what the people of Altoona have done and can do. And I think at the end of the day, for me, that's what matters the most. So, I'm delighted to be here. I am delighted to be part of this. I told Joe earlier today, a phrase came to my mind, Bennett and Wick's excellent adventure. And that's what we're on. So, thank you for coming. And I'll turn it over to you, right? Yeah, thanks. Davidson Ward.
Thank you, Bennett. It is our absolute, Wick. Thank you, Wick. Wrong person from the adventure here.
He's here in spirit.
He's here in spirit for sure. It's our absolute honor to have been selected to be the strategic partner to help the Railroaders Memorial Museum put this locomotive back on track. Of all of our steam locomotive projects, this one in particular has a unique set of special challenges, we'll call it. The very first challenge, of course, is the design of the boiler itself behind us. If you think about a normal locomotive boiler, it's a nice cylinder across the top all the way back. This locomotive boiler and those of the Pennsylvania Railroad are of the bell pair type, which means they have a different shaped firebox, which is something that's relatively uncommon here in the United States. As Joe mentioned, the K4 is the embodiment of the people of Altoona. It was engineered here, it was designed here, it was built here. It was the first scientifically invented and designed locomotive. They had a building with a treadmill for locomotives in it, and they went with predecessor locomotives and tweaked things and modified things, and eventually, in 1918, 1361 rolled off the line. It served the Pennsylvania Railroad through 1956. It was put on display at the Horseshoe Curve, sat there for many years, came off the curve in 85, put back into service, ran for a couple years, and it encountered a mechanical issue. It went down, and in the 1990s, additional work indicated that there was greater problems than they first thought. The mechanics at the time dug into it, and after many years working on the locomotive, work finally stopped in 2010, and the pieces were brought back here and assembled in Altoona. In 2019, Wick and Bennett reached out to us and said, we want to take a close look at the boiler of the K4 to see if it's possible to put it back into service. This was an opportunity for us to look at this from square one. The three of us came to Altoona, met with Joe. We spent many hours on the 4th floor of the main museum building, going through banker's boxes of old paperwork, scribbled notes, material test reports, to try to figure out what had been done to the locomotive boiler, what different mechanical contractors had done to it, and get to a baseline of what we believed had been put into the locomotive. We then worked with a non-destructive testing company to come out, test the sheets, see what metal had been put into the boiler, and really get a handle of where this pressure vessel is today. We assembled an engineering report that we submitted to the Federal Railroad Administration, who is the jurisdictional body overseeing this project. The FRA recently gave us a letter of concurrence saying that the approach we have to putting this original boiler back into service at its original pressure is approved. So we have the green light to get this boiler back in service, but there are a lot of other pieces here in the roundhouse that you'll see as you walk around that also need attention. The bottom line, however, is that this project will only be possible with the hard work of the volunteers, the support of the community, the vision of the board of the museum, and the overall spirit of Altoona coming behind it. Our team is absolutely humbled to be involved in the project, and we'll be around by the boiler after the press conference to answer any questions you might have.
And so we took your questions remotely through Facebook and first talked to Wick Mormon. I apologize for the audio quality in this one. There was a bit of wind noise. I tried to clean that up as much as I could. Bear that in mind, but what Wick has to say is still really good. All right, I'm here with board president Wick Mormon, who we've had the pleasure of having on the show again. Now, I think the first question I have for you, Wick, is you've been involved with so many steam engine projects throughout the years. In your mind, what makes the K4 unique?
Well, I'll remind you that the word unique means there's only one, right? So there's only one K4 that can be restored to operation, right? But beyond that, it is the iconic locomotive of the Pennsylvania Railroad, right? In a way that I don't think any other classes are. So it's an important symbol of the Pennsy, as well as being important for the town of Altoona and the history of the Altoona shops.
Jim Lipnitz, one of our listeners, asks whether NS is going to be, Norfolk Southern is going to be willing to work in terms of ferry moves and so forth. And I'm sure a lot of that's still in the drafting stage right now. But given your previous role with NS, what can you say about what you could envision the relationship to look like going forward?
I really don't know, just to tell you the truth. I do think they'll be cooperative, but as to exactly what that relationship ends up being, we really haven't had those conversations. We're not that close, right? We've got a locomotive to put back together. So when the time comes, we'll have those conversations, and I think NS will cooperate with us. Altoona's everybody at the company knows how important Altoona has been for Norfolk Southern.
And how important central Pennsylvania is for railroading as well, given the fact that now this is the second big announcement that you're involved with in 2 years involving railroading. I imagine that the amount of goodwill that's coming off of what's going on with the East Broad Top and the goodwill that's being developed here at the Railroaders Memorial Museum with the K4 restoration can really go hand in hand.
Well, we look at this and we see this great museum and the K4 restoration. We see what's happening at the Everett Railroad, which is operating steam, right? With the East Broad Top, which is one of a kind. And then also with Strasburg, that there's a real nexus of attractions for all kinds of people to come visit, rail enthusiasts, historians. The East Broad Top has a set of shops that will appeal to industrial archaeologists of all kinds. So I think this is a really, really important project for a lot of reasons, but then it fits together to create a nexus in this part of the world that will be unparalleled, I think, in the United States.
It'll be a fascinating nexus to see. Wick, thank you so much.
Nick, my pleasure, as always.
I'm here with Davidson Ward, who is also a former guest on the Roundhouse podcast. We are introducing him today as the president of FMW Solutions, which is the partner that's been selected to work with the Railroaders Memorial Museum on the K4 restoration. So, Davidson, I have to say that ever since 15 minutes ago when I opened the floor for questions on Facebook, I've been getting a ton of them. So I won't hit you over the head with all of them, I promise. But let's go through one that I've been seeing a lot, which is a timeline of the project overall.
I think the overall timeline is somewhat dependent upon the pace of fundraising. If all the money was in hand and we were going full bore, maybe you're looking at a 3 to 4 year window, but again, it's really difficult to put a fine point on any steam locomotive restoration. As we all know, when you get into them, you sometimes come across things that are really unexpected.
Hudson Henry asks, will the locomotive have PTC, positive train control, and cab signals for mainline excursions?
No definite decision's been made yet on that. I know that a lot of the other big steam operators have been working together to devise a means to put PTC onto steam locomotives. Obviously, the 765, the nickel plate 765, has cab signals that it's used in the past during operations. I think that will largely be dependent upon where the locomotive operates in the future and the needs and the cooperation of both the host railroads and perhaps whatever FRA jurisdiction applies to the PTC for the locomotive.
A lot of people are also asking about the boiler because there's been conversation with it being a Bel Pair design, as you mentioned during the press conference. Is it sounding like we're going to be able to use the original boiler for this restoration?
We will be using the original boiler for the restoration, full stop. We're going to repair the boiler, reuse the majority of the boiler barrel and portions of the firebox. There's a lot of the firebox itself will need to be replaced. There is a lot of times you'll read online, people will say, oh, Bel Pair boilers are somehow banned in the United States, or Bel Pair boilers are not suitable for service. The Bel Pair boilers are fine. They just have to meet the engineering standards in the Form 4. When this locomotive was built and designed, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is now the STB, the ICC had a factor of safety of 3.75 for these boilers. It's now a factor of 4, and we talk about the Form 4, and there's a factor safety 4, and so throughout the life of the boiler, the regulations and safety became more stringent. We now, following the 1999 revision of Part 230, we have even more stringent requirements for certain aspects of the boiler. So we'll make sure that with the work that we do, we meet all those safety standards.
Tying in with what you were talking about in terms of group efforts to look at issues like positive train control, Nate Hatton asks, has there been any thoughts of partnering with other groups rebuilding engines to share the cost of new parts, such as the T1 Trust out of the Ohio area building that locomotive from the ground up?
That's a very good question. We have a good relationship with the T1 Trust. Our Vice President of Engineering, Wolf Fengler, is actually the engineer on their boiler, so we're very intimately involved with what they're doing. And a lot of the steam operators and steam restoration experts talk to each other, and orders have been pooled in the past. Oftentimes when you go to order boiler flues in particular, the larger of the flues that go in the boiler, the 5.5-inch diameter ones, you'll go overseas to Germany to order. And so in this case, we have the flues on hand, but if we had to order them, that's an opportunity for different groups to pool the order and save cost by doing a larger order. So yeah, I think as we get further away from the steam era, as we get into this time where we all have to be somewhat innovative to restore the locomotives, collaboration is great.
When we last talked to you, we were talking about torrefied biomass and the idea of finding renewable sources of energy for steam locomotives. Do you imagine that the research that you've conducted through that may play a role in what you're doing with this particular project, or are they two isolated research endeavors in their own right?
Those are two isolated endeavors. I would say that on the liquid fuel side of things, unrelated to this project, there have been locomotive operators like Grand Canyon that have been using liquid biofuels, but yeah, it's really two separate undertakings.
What makes you most excited personally about what you're embarking on here?
personally, I'm excited to have the chance to work with a team and a group of volunteers to see this really historic locomotive back in service. It's everyone that has an interest in trains knows about the K4. Everyone knows that the K4 has not run since the 1980s, and it'd really be a true honor for us to be able to get this locomotive back in service, not just for what it represents as the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but also just the history of preservation and doing good work in that industry.
FMW, that's a name that's a bit new to me and might be new to some of our listeners as well. So can you provide a brief overview of what your company is and what your missions are even beyond this project?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Wolf Fengler, Shane Metter, and myself, Davidson Ward, FMW, we founded FMW Solutions in 2016, and we went full-time in 2018 with the company, and we do multidisciplinary services to the rail industry. So we do steam locomotive restoration, we do diesel locomotive repair, we do sort of modern locomotive research and development, we do hydrogen fuel cell locomotives and battery locomotives. So we really span 200 years of technological history in the rail motive power space. And since founding, we've been involved in a couple high-profile projects. We just last year completed the restoration of the U.S. Sugar 148 down in Florida, another Pacific, and certainly we're just honored to be able to work here with this larger Pacific, the 1361.
It's going to be exciting to follow it, and I'm sure we'll have you back on the show to discuss it in greater detail as things go forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Davidson.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
I hope you guys enjoyed listening and learning more about what is to come from the restoration. And I'm sure down the road we'll have some more people on the podcast to talk about this as things develop. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for submitting your questions through Facebook. And remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.